Okay, cool. I'll get going because I know this takes at least half an hour. So, yeah, my name's Graham. I'm from Lancashire, up north originally, but spent the last 6 years in Switzerland working in the central IT services of the Swiss Federal Technical University in Zurich, otherwise known as ETH. And I'm going to talk today about a project, a silly script I wrote called erase-install. Erase-install is a tool for erasing, installing, and reinstalling, erasing or reinstalling macOS with a single command or click. It brings together open source tools to perform a workflow which will download a macOS installer and use it to perform a silent reinstallation. The only user interaction required is on Apple Silicon Macs, where we need the user's password. This is just a screen recording. You're seeing the terminal output because I invoked the script from the terminal. If you're running it from a management tool, you wouldn't see that, of course. The script is agnostic to which management tool you're using. It just needs to have the ability to run a script, or you could do it via a package. So I'm aware of it being used from Jamf Pro, SimpleMDM, Jamf Now, Workspace ONE, Intune, Monkey, Mozile, maybe more. We'll look again at this video later when you've got a bit more context, because it takes too long. So behind the scenes, it's a big, long bash script. And yes, big, long bash scripts are not considered best practice. But for many of us ordinary Mac admins who aren't software engineers, it's just a natural place that we start is in bash to try and solve the problem. And before we know it, it's 3,000, 5,000, 7,000 lines long, like some of these other tools. And just like Kevin White's Superman and Armin and Friends Installamator, erase-install has got a lot of use and attention over the past couple of years, much more than I could have anticipated. And that's because, regardless of best practices, these are tools that have been shared, so you can use them, and they are proving themselves to solve problems that us Mac admins have. So in this talk, I want to achieve three things. I'll give you a short synopsis of the erase-install project. I'll look forward to the time when we don't need it anymore. And as a representative of ordinary Mac admins, I'll share what experience I've gained from maintaining a project that I open sourced that's built up a relatively large user base. So to talk about how this came about, let's go back to the beginning. iOS has had erase all contents and settings since, forever. But back in the early 2010s, we could only dream about having this kind of feature in OS X. But it was okay because we had good redeployment workflows using NetBoot, Deploy Studio, imaging, all that stuff. But this all started coming undone in 2017 when Apple introduced the T2 Macs, starting with the iMac Pro. And NetBoot was killed, and imaging started to get less stable because of BridgeOS and all that. So we pivoted, and device enrollment program became our new setting up workflow. But for redeployments, we still had to get a clean OS on the system. And back then, getting that magical, elusive remote management screen was extremely hit and miss. Reinstalling from the recovery partition, for example, wouldn't always clear the old DP record, and the enrollment just wasn't attempted when you tried to run Setup Assistant. So in our case, we would use internet recovery, which was more reliable, but that meant even more clicks, even slower, no way to automate this. 2 years earlier, though, El Capitan was released and had a glimpse of what would become a new option for us to install OS X. El Capitan came as an installer app, and inside the app bundle, in the resources folder, there's this command line tool called Start OS Install. And every version of macOS since then has included this tool. At that point, Start OS Install wasn't massively useful. It couldn't be run silently without any interaction, because you had to agree to the license. With Sierra, we did get this flag to agree to the license and this undocumented flag called no interaction, meaning we could run this unattended from a script, for example. And by the way, that isn't needed anymore, but it was for a few macOS versions. Now you can run it unattended just with the top one. StartOS install still wasn't relevant for redeployments until February 2018, when Apple unusually published a support article which announced an upcoming option for the StartOS install called erase-install. And this allowed us to completely wipe the system drive and install a fresh macOS system in a single command. And it could also be done silently with the no interaction flag. Just need to emphasize that the StartOS install binary is only present in the installer app, not on the system itself, and it can't be run from the recovery partition. So to use StartOS install to reinstall or erase a system, first of all, you need to get the installer on the system, and only then can you run it to do the thing. So during the beta phase of that spring release of macOS High Sierra 10.13.4, I was intrigued by this and started trying to write a solution that would use this feature to provide that one-click, start-to-finish, erase all contents and settings button in our Jamf Pro service at my org. A couple of months earlier, fortunately, Greg Nagel had published a script for downloading macOS installers directly from Apple's software catalogs, which he called install-macOS.py. And even more sort of coincidentally, exactly the time I was looking at that, Rich Troughton blogged about it. So I had a look at this script. I had to adapt it so that it could automatically give me the latest installer that was compatible with the system that it's running on, so that it could be run unattended. Just add a bit of logic in there. Once I got that working, I wrote a quick wrapper script in Bash, which would grab this version of install macOS, run it to grab the latest Maco installer, and then call StartOS install from that installer with the erase install option to wipe and reinstall the device. Throw in some Jamf helper user dialogues so that the user could first see when the installer was downloading, and then block the screen with a full screen dialog when the preparation for erasing began. Upload it to our Jamf instances, create a self-service policy, and there we have that one-click erase all contents and settings button back in 2018. When 10.13.4 was released publicly, that was ready to go, so I decided to blog about it and uploaded the script to Git in case it was useful to somebody else. So it kind of needed a name, and I decided to call it erase-install because that's all it did. And I hadn't thought of using StartOS install for one-click upgrades at that point, or until that point. But it was obviously useful to be able to offer a method of upgrading without requiring admin rights and without having to manually package up the installer. So it was hardly any additional code into the erase install script to add a reinstall option so that we could also have a one-click upgrade button in our self-service. So within a couple of months, calling the script erase install was not a good idea. Never mind. Anyway, so now we had a good solution for upgrades and redeployments. For software updates, we had our tried and tested command for forcing updates using a script with the software update command. But this also hit a problem with the T2 Mac, because T2 Mac sometimes had to be shut down instead of restarted for some updates. Apple added the -R option to the command, which would figure out whether a shutdown was necessary, but this wasn't great user experience because, let's say the user ran the update at the end of the day, they'd come in the next day and the machine's mysteriously off, and they turn it on and now have to wait half an hour for the upgrade to complete. So, yeah. On the other hand, if you did the update using the full installer with StartOS install, you didn't need this shutdown, and you could potentially have a cleaner workflow. The machine would be ready when they come in the morning. Furthermore, software update command started getting just unreliable. Updates would fail to show, or it would fail to install at all. The system might end up in boot recovery state. I think we're all aware of these types of things. And Greg Nagel, who I think I always trust to make wise decisions, lost patience with this in 2020 and removed the software update command from Monkey for upgrades and updates that require a restart because of this unpredictability. But StartOS install was still reliable. So using StartOS install or erase-install for updates was at least a predictable workflow, even if it's always seemed like overkill to use a full installer to do a minor update. And then at WWDC 2020, everything changed again as Apple announced the Apple Silicon chips. The DTK was released, along with the beta version of Big Sur. We were lucky to get one, so I could test this stuff out. And we found that the Apple Silicon computers required a volume owner to supply their password via a graphical prompt to unlock the system volume, making an unattended update now impossible. On the other hand, soon after that, we got from Apple a built-in erase all contents and settings tool. Woohoo! So the original use case of this script had been sherlocked when it works, that is. That is a screenshot from this laptop. I tried it out, but no, it's not having it. Anyway, with this built-in erase feature and with all these new problems around Apple Silicon, you'd think the use of this script probably would have died away at that point. But to my surprise, quite the opposite has proved to be the case. We did get in StartOS install the option to allow us to enter the account name and password for Apple Silicon computers. Unfortunately in plain text, but at least could be scripted. And it didn't need to be an admin password, only the volume owner. And we could control when we ask for the user's password in this workflow, and also how to present the question to the user. So I added this graphical prompt to the users to ask for the user's password to erase install so we could continue to use it at all. And perhaps because of software updates and reliability, and because this script that was popular at the time for Jamf customers for doing Mac upgrades was never adapted for this Apple Silicon workflow, I guess that's probably the main reasons why erase install use has been ballooning ever since then. And I have worked on a bunch of improvements since then, past couple of years, as this usage has increased and the questions have increased about it, and maybe the improvements have also caused it to be used more. But the functionality since then has not really fundamentally changed since the release of Apple Silicon. So that's the history of the project. Let's have a quick look at what it looks like today. If you download the package that I've provided on the GitHub repo, this installs or includes all the dependencies you'll need to use the script, which these days is namely Bart Reardon's awesome Swift Dialog app and Nindigil's Mist CLI tool, which has now replaced my version of install macOS. Alternatively, you can run the script directly and it will download Mist and Swift Dialog when it needs them. You can even run a curl command to grab it ephemerally and feed in the arguments just like this. And that's what I did in the video that I'm going to show you again now and talk to you through a bit more. So we're going to run the reinstall option here to upgrade from Monterey to Ventura. And as I said, you wouldn't see the terminal if you're running this from a management tool, but it does allow you to see a bit more about what's going on in the background here. And of course, this has been shortened to a couple of minutes from the hour or whatever it might take. So the users ask for their password, which is required in Apple Silicon. It then downloads Mist and Swift Dialog if they're not already there. And erase install tells Mist to look for the latest available macOS installer because we didn't specify a version. So it's 13.3.1 here. A dialog shows the percentage once it reaches 1%, and then that takes as long as it takes. Once it's downloaded, Mist has to compile all the components that came from the Apple software catalog. It creates a DMG, and once it's done that, it then copies the compiled installer from the DMG into the applications folder, and Mist has then done its job. Once that's done, erase-install takes over again and invokes start-OS install to reinstall macOS on the device. This time you get a full screen dialog. It shows the percentage progress of the OS preparation phase. It's reading the output from start-OS install in the background. And with this option, it's preventing the user from doing anything now while it's maybe too late. There are other options. Once it's reached the end, once it's got to the 100%-ish of preparation, the machine reboots automatically. And once it's complete, once it reboots, you'll see it's now on Ventura. Weirdly, it then presents me with a Monterey login screen, but it is Ventura. Maybe it's the VM. And there we are. You can see there that, I don't know where the pointer is on this thing, is that it? Yeah. It only got to 98.2% in this case, but that was apparently enough. Sometimes it's 105%. Can't rely on it totally. As you saw, just specifying the reinstall or erase options is enough for most people, actually. But there are a whole array of different or additional options you can use. For example, if you want to specify which installer you want to download, you can do it at the OS level, version level. Pick the one you already have. If you want it to replace any outdated installers or any that are no longer valid, if you want it to check for an AC power connection, you can add this option, and it'll count down, give the user a chance. You can add this option, which forces the user to confirm that they want to continue after the download has happened. And there's an option to add a reboot delay, which in sort of more recent versions of macOS, the preparation phase is happening before the reboot rather than after now. So it allows the user to carry on working while the preparation is happening. Then they'll see, they get a utility dialog instead of a full screen, so they can carry on. And then they get a countdown that says, OK, now you really need to save your work. You've got, in this case, 5 minutes. I've been showing dialogues in English, but the text is available in 5 languages, depending on what language is set on the device. Fortunately, I've had a lot of help from native speakers, so hopefully these aren't too bad. To see all the possible options, you just need to run the command with --help. And the wiki hopefully has pretty much everything you could possibly need to know. But if not, there's also the Slack channel if you're still not sure what to do. And hopefully there might be a bit of time for questions at the end, and I'm here for the next 2 days, so happy to answer on that. So we kind of know that erase-install shouldn't really need to exist. Let's look at what Apple have been doing in the meantime to try and plug some of the holes that this script has been filling. All the way back with the release of Catalina, we got a new flag for the software update command called fetch full installer. This allowed the download of the full installer directly from Apple's software update catalog, without the need for a script like install macOS, for example. But unfortunately, despite it has been improved over the years, it's never been as reliable as the methods used in install macOS or Mist. I guess it is the software update command, and we have problems with that at the moment, right? So I think that's it. For some organizations, though, particularly if they have network restrictions, this can be the best option, and it honors the MDM update deferrals. Also, it can make use of a caching server. You have to test it out, but yeah. So I've built this option into erase-install script as an alternative option. You just add the -- fetch full installer flag if you want to make use of this, but still have the dialogues and things that erase-install offers. Another useful development with Ventura was the ability to upgrade from an older major macOS using a Delta update from the software update pane without needing admin rights. And this should make upgrades in the future easier. Of course, only useful if software update gets reliable again. Some of the problems we've had with software update command hanging over the last 2 to 3 major macOS versions are supposedly fixed in 13.3. I think it's still early to say whether that's really the case, but hopefully it's going to start to be reliable enough that we could start to risk putting in scripts again. And we have MDM commands now available to enforce software updates, which is Apple's preferred method, including an option to allow the user to defer update a set number of times or to completely enforce it. I don't think these commands are yet robust enough to rely on them, although that depends on your MDM vendor's implementation of it, I have to say. Especially the full enforcement command. Not sure that's good for one-to-one machine. Yeah, if you want, there is no interaction at all. It just happens. So, but Kevin Superman is a great attempt at improving that user experience. The fact that it takes over 7,500 lines of bash code to achieve that tells you maybe how far away from a completely satisfactory built-in solution we have at the moment. So yeah, I would say maybe we're not quite at the stage where tools like Nudge, Superman, and erase-install are going to be obsolete. But we can only hope that in a couple of weeks with WWDC 23, maybe we won't need some of them. Watch this space. Okay, so on to the last part of this talk, aimed at Mac admins who perhaps haven't yet embarked on sharing their own code. And erase-install is just an example of what you might face if you do make a script available for use by others, if it starts to get used a lot. So I'm sure my experiences are no different to Kevin and Armin and so on, and Eric. So you've written this cool thing and you think others might find it useful. Your company says it's okay to share it. What are the consequences? Is it going to generate extra work? Are other people going to pitch in? Will it grow into something more than originally planned? And what happens if you can't or don't want to continue maintaining it? Just putting a script on GitHub doesn't mean any extra work. Obviously, like maybe nobody uses it. I have loads of scripts on GitHub that nobody's using except myself, and maybe not me anymore either. Others are getting used, but they're just small, simple scripts and just work, so they don't really need much documentation or support. But erase-install is a bigger, more complex thing that's had to keep evolving. And maybe it was clumped together as a quick idea and maybe not particularly well written or documented at the beginning. So anyway, nonetheless, it started to get found and used. And when people start using it, they start asking about it in the Mac admin Slack and Jamf Nation and GitHub. And of course, just like anything I'm doing at work, if people are asking for help with something I built or designed, or they're reporting bugs, then I can't ignore it. It's been easier to help once I adopted a channel in the Mac admin Slack. Monitoring for keywords that relate to the project throughout Slack gave me notifications whenever somebody mentioned it. And then I can go and react to that, just point them to the channel rather than answer it in that place, so that more and more people come into the channel and sort of an increasing number of people who are starting to use the tool can answer questions by the newcomers, not just me. And we can see it's now, I think this is quite an old screenshot, but it's more than 1,200 members. And averaging 120 messages a week. Kind of crazy for a little script. But so just to say, if you get in this situation, it can be good to turn off notifications in the evening, particularly when you live in Europe, because a lot of the requests are coming US time in my evening. So if you want a life, pro tip. And keeping on top of the questions can be challenging at times, or it has been at times. Sometimes it can feel like a help desk would be nice. Yeah, don't be surprised. Some people might not always look at the document or look for documentation before they ask for help. And you shouldn't underestimate how explicit and complete the documentation needs to be. But making an FAQ page has been really helpful. Far quicker just to give someone a link to the answer, the question you've already answered, rather than having to think of what was it, and write it all out again. Also found it a really good idea to ask people to open a GitHub issue for any sort of bug or question that can't be answered immediately. Otherwise, it's just too hard to keep on top of all that. GitHub discussions are also useful. This is more like Slack, and not everyone is in Slack, so it's maybe more, if you turn this feature on in GitHub, it's right there in the repo, so maybe people might see it more obviously. And inevitability about sharing a project is that it might not work in different environments to your own. And people also have their own ideas about how the thing should work. And what we're talking about here is feature requests. And feature requests can be a really time-consuming form of support. You have to think a bit more about this. So I've found it essential to ask people also to record their feature requests in GitHub in the repo, so that I can keep an overview of these things to consider next time I have any time to work on this project. And if you sort of add the labels in there, you can break things down into stuff that you can just go and fix immediately, or you need more input from them when the time comes and you have time to look at it. Also, important questions to ask yourself when you get feature requests, like, do you actually think that it's a useful improvement? Is it really going to help anyone apart from that person who asked for it? Is it relevant to the original reason for writing this thing? And maybe more importantly, like, I maintain this at work, and is that request relevant to my organization's requirements? Because they're paying me to do this. Well, theoretically, I mean, apart from all those evenings. But how difficult and complicated is it going to be to design the change, and will it make the overall project more difficult to understand in the future? And am I interested enough in the feature to support it in the future if it stops working for some reason? Is it relevant to me? And these similar considerations apply to pull requests. This is a bug or a feature request, but instead of just the person just asking you to fix it, they update the code themselves, and they only ask you to merge in their changes into your project. And Git is really clever at figuring out how to safely merge their stuff into yours. And I think pull requests tend to happen more with shell script code, shell script projects, because far more of us understand shell than other programming languages. But again, I found it really important to make sure I understand the code that they're submitting before you accept and merge it. Because if you don't understand it, you're really just building problems into your project that might come to haunt you later. JS is important. And also, perhaps it's obvious, but you don't have to accept pull requests. If you don't want to accept it, that person can still maintain a fork of the project with their changes in it. They still benefited from the work you did, and they'll still be able to merge any changes that you make back into their fork of it in the future, because, like I said, Git's really clever at this stuff. And I mean, I don't know how many of these forks are active, but plenty of people have gone ahead and made their own fork. And I do hear people they continually use their own fork, which has different dialogues and things like that in it. Same also true if you decide you can't or don't want to continue maintaining the project. There are all sorts of legitimate reasons why you might want to stop maintaining some open source project. But again, people can make their own fork. They can maintain it themselves. They could even take it over if they think it's still useful to them when you can't spare the time anymore. Just make it clear in the README of the repo that your version is no longer maintained, and people will slowly move on. So, summarize. If you open source your code, yes, expect more work than if you hadn't published it. You can mitigate that a bit by taking the time from the beginning to create good documentation. Make a Slack channel if you're starting to get questions about it. Create FAQs as you answer the questions, save you repeating yourself over and over. Keep on top of issues and problems by encouraging people to record it in your GitHub repo. Keep the code simple and readable, even if it might seem less efficient. This increases the chance that people will send you pull requests and answer their own questions because it's more understandable to more people. And finally, this is a really helpful community in my experience. You can expect a lot of thanks and a lot of help. So don't be shy in sharing your code, because everyone's really supportive. And I think that's the main reason I would recommend open sourcing your code. I could have never really anticipated all the amount of thanks I've received from people who are using this silly script. But also, I've received so much help from this community, it's only fair to give a little bit back, whether that's sharing code or answering questions in Slack. And one last thing, unlike me, take some time to think of a good name for your project. Preferably one that doesn't mean anything, like Monkey, Kmart, Mist, Superman, Sal. A descriptive name can quickly become a bad idea if you add things or whatever, change it. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening. If there's any questions. Any questions? Everyone's hungry. No. Hey.
It's a 3,500 line bash script. Are you ever thinking of moving it to like a 2,900 line ZSH script? or another programming language? Like Swift.
I'd have to learn Swift first. ZSH, maybe. But there's an element to which this project, I keep saying it, like, it shouldn't really exist. Like, the initial use cases have largely been sherlocked. Not quite, because, like, for erasal contents and settings, for example, if you don't know what the Apple ID, if it's signed in as an Apple ID and you don't know what it is, then you can't use that method. So you have to do something else, and this will still work for that. Or if it just doesn't work like it did on this machine for some mysterious. But that's more sort of niche and kind of legacy workaround than maybe it was a few years ago. And this kind of large use case at the moment that we have for doing minor updates with it is kind of ridiculous, even though it's currently reliable and so people are using it. But I mean, we keep hoping that that'll get fixed, right? So how much time I would spend to completely re-architect it into some other language when Bash is still there.
Fair comment. Yeah. Anybody else?
Hi, sorry. Just wondering, as someone who's sort of just getting into the programmatically controlling macOS and that sort of thing, would you, if you were to start this from the beginning now, what language would you be using? Would you be doing it in Swift, or would you still stick with Bash, or what would you do if you could start all over again?
I mean, I still think it has use as a shell script because of the methods. It makes it easy for people to use it in various ways without being specific to a particular MDM. So like in Jam, for example, I provide a package, and that's sort of one way to do it, and then you can use a command to run the script that's been installed by the package. But some people prefer to just upload the script itself directly into Jamf. and use parameters and things like that. I don't think it's too bad that it's in well, maybe D shell would be good idea now, but yeah, if I get the time to learn Swift, maybe it'd be a cool project to try. But all right, thanks very much.